3 months ago, I thought my biggest problem was deciding between grad school applications. Then, a bank foreclosure notice arrived at my apartment with my name on it, for a house I had never seen, a loan I had never signed for, and a debt of $250,000 that was about to destroy my credit forever. My parents had used my identity to secure their dream home, and when their financial house of cards collapsed, they left me holding the bag while they disappeared to their lake house, blocking my calls and pretending I did not exist. Hey everyone! Before we dive into this absolute nightmare that turned my world upside down, I need to ask where you are watching from, because this story gets wild, and I want to know how far this reaches. If family financial betrayal hits close to home for you, smash that like button right now and subscribe, because you are going to want to see exactly how I turn the tables on the people who were supposed to protect me. Trust me, the revenge in this story is absolutely worth the wait. My name is Evangeline Rivers, and I had always been the responsible daughter. While my younger brother Mason partied his way through college on my parents' dime, I worked 3 jobs to pay my own tuition, graduated summa cum laude, and even helped them with their mortgage payments when Dad's construction business hit rough patches. I thought we were a close family. I was wrong about everything. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic as he handed me the thick manila envelope. My hands shook as I read my name, Evangeline Marie Rivers, listed as the primary borrower on a mortgage for a property in Maplewood Estates, a fancy neighborhood I had driven through but never dreamed of living in. The loan amount made my stomach drop $250,000, with 18 months of missed payments and late fees that brought the total debt to nearly $300,000. I immediately called the bank, certain there had been a mistake. After being transferred 6 times, I finally reached someone in the foreclosure department who confirmed my worst fears. The loan was legitimate, signed in my name with my social security number, and the property was indeed facing foreclosure. When I insisted I had never signed anything, the representative's voice grew cold and professional. She informed me that fraud claims needed to be filed with law enforcement and that the foreclosure proceedings would continue regardless. My next call was to my parents. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I tried Mom's cell, Dad's cell, even the landline at their house. Nothing. Growing panic made my chest tight as I drove to their house, the modest 3-bedroom ranch where I had grown up. The driveway was empty, the mailbox overflowing, and the neighbors informed me that Linda and Robert Rivers had left town 3 weeks ago for an extended vacation at their lake house. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a bottle of wine and my laptop, determined to uncover the truth. I started with public records, searching for the property in Maplewood Estates. What I found made my blood run cold. The house had been purchased 18 months ago for $250,000 in cash, then immediately mortgaged for the same amount using my name and credit. The mortgage proceeds had gone directly into my parents' joint checking account. I pulled my credit report and discovered the financial devastation they had wreaked. The mortgage was just the beginning. There were 3 credit cards in my name, all maxed out, totaling $60,000 in debt. A car loan for $45,000 for a truck I had never seen. Even a home equity line of credit for $30,000 against the Maplewood property. My credit score had plummeted from 800 to 420, destroying 15 years of careful financial planning. The deeper I dug, the more horrifying it became. They had been using my identity for over 2 years, starting small with a department store credit card, then gradually escalating to major purchases. Bank statements I requested showed a pattern of transfers from accounts in my name to their personal accounts. They had essentially made me their personal ATM, using my pristine credit to fund a lifestyle they could not afford. Text messages I sent to my brother Mason went unanswered for days. When he finally responded, his message was brief and devastating. Mom and Dad said you would find out eventually. They needed the money for the business and figured you would understand since you are family. They said you make good money and could handle the payments. The casual cruelty of that message hit me like a physical blow. Not only had my parents stolen my identity and destroyed my financial future, but they had also convinced my brother that I should be grateful for the privilege of funding their fraud. The family I had sacrificed for, worked multiple jobs to support and loved unconditionally, had been systematically robbing me blind while I smiled and handed them checks for their mortgage. I spent the next week gathering documentation, printing bank statements, credit reports, and public records. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. My parents had committed multiple felonies, including identity theft, fraud, and forgery. They had stolen my future and left me with debt that would take decades to resolve, all while planning their escape to their lake house, where they thought they could wait out the consequences. The betrayal cut deeper than the financial damage. These were the people who had taught me about honesty and integrity. Dad had always said that family meant everything, that blood was thicker than water, and that we always took care of each other. Mom had raised me to be responsible with money, to pay my bills on time, to never live beyond my means. The hypocrisy was staggering. As I sat surrounded by evidence of their crimes, I realized that my old life was over. The daughter who had trusted blindly, who had sacrificed her own comfort for family loyalty, who had believed that love meant never questioning family members' motives, that version of me had died the moment I opened that foreclosure notice. What emerged from the ashes was someone harder, angrier, and absolutely determined to make them face consequences for what they had done. The Lake County Sheriff's Department treated my case like routine paperwork until I walked into their office with 17 pounds of documentation organized in color-coded binders. Detective Sarah Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, initially seemed skeptical when I explained that my own parents had stolen my identity. Her attitude changed dramatically when I opened the first binder and began walking her through the timeline of fraud. Within an hour, Detective Martinez had called in 2 additional officers and a financial crimes specialist. They had never seen identity theft of this magnitude perpetrated by family members, especially with such meticulous documentation of the crimes. The evidence I had gathered was so comprehensive that they were able to obtain search warrants for my parents' bank accounts and the Maplewood property within 48 hours. While the criminal investigation proceeded, I knew I needed to protect myself financially and publicly. My parents had not just stolen money, they had stolen my reputation. I contacted every creditor and explained the situation, filing formal fraud reports with each one. Most were sympathetic once they saw the police report numbers, but the process was exhausting and humiliating. I had to prove repeatedly that I was the victim, not the perpetrator. The breakthrough came when Detective Martinez called me on a Friday afternoon with news that made my heart race. The search of my parents' lake house had yielded a treasure trove of evidence, including my birth certificate, social security card, and copies of my driver's license that they had used to impersonate me. Even more damaging, they had found a safe containing forged documents with my signature practiced dozens of times in my mother's handwriting. But the most devastating discovery was my father's detailed notebook documenting their fraud scheme. He had kept meticulous records of every transaction, every forged signature, every dollar they had stolen. In his own handwriting, he had written notes like, "Evangeline's credit is perfect, can use for another 50,000. And she trusts us completely, will never suspect until too late." Reading those words felt like being stabbed in the chest by someone I had loved unconditionally. The notebook also revealed that this had been planned for years. They had been monitoring my credit score, waiting for me to establish enough credit history to be useful to them. The timing of their escalation coincided with my father's business failures, which he had hidden from the entire family while using my identity to maintain their lifestyle. They had even discussed what to do when I inevitably discovered their crimes with my mother, suggesting they could guilt her into not pressing charges because family forgives family. Armed with this evidence, I decided it was time to go public. I had been silent about the situation, too ashamed to tell friends and colleagues that my own parents had destroyed my financial life. But their casual assumption that I would protect them because of family loyalty had pushed me beyond caring about privacy or family reputation. I started with social media posting a carefully worded statement explaining that I was the victim of identity theft perpetrated by family members and warning others to protect their personal information even from relatives. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers began sharing their own stories of financial abuse by family members. I realized that family financial fraud was far more common than anyone wanted to admit. Next, I contacted the local newspaper. The story of parents stealing their daughter's identity to fund their lifestyle resonated with the community, especially when the reporter learned about the evidence and the ongoing criminal investigation. The article was published with the headline, "Local Woman Fights Back Against Family Identity Theft," and it included photos of some of the evidence I had gathered. The newspaper article was picked up by regional news outlets, and within a week, I was fielding calls from television stations wanting to interview me. I appeared on the local morning show holding up the foreclosure notice that had started everything and explaining how family members could protect themselves from financial abuse. The segment went viral on social media with thousands of shares and comments from people who had experienced similar betrayals. The public attention achieved exactly what I had hoped for. It made it impossible for my parents to hide or minimize their crimes. Friends and neighbors began calling me with information about my parents' recent spending habits, their lies about sudden windfalls, and their panicked departure from town when the investigation began. The community that had once respected them now saw them as criminals who had victimized their own daughter. Detective Martinez informed me that the public pressure had expedited the investigation. The district attorney's office was treating the case as a priority because of the media attention and the clear evidence of premeditated fraud. Arrest warrants were issued within 2 weeks, and my parents' photos were published in the local newspaper as wanted suspects who had fled to avoid prosecution. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from the mortgage company. The media coverage had prompted them to investigate their own role in the fraud, and they had discovered that several of their loan officers had failed to follow proper verification procedures. They offered to remove the mortgage from my credit report entirely and to pursue my parents for the full amount owed plus legal fees and damages. The credit card companies and car loan provider quickly followed suit, recognizing that their failure to verify my identity had made them partially liable for the fraud. Within a month of going public, my credit score began recovering as fraudulent accounts were removed and my actual financial history was restored. The financial nightmare my parents had created was finally being undone one account at a time. The media attention brought unexpected allies into my fight for justice. The first was Rebecca Walsh, a financial attorney who had seen my television interview and recognized the broader implications of my case. She contacted me through the news station, offering to represent me pro bono in a civil lawsuit against my parents. Her motivation was professional and personal. She had seen too many families destroyed by financial abuse, and she wanted to establish legal precedents that would protect other victims. Rebecca was a force of nature, a Harvard law graduate who specialized in financial crimes and had built her career prosecuting white-collar criminals. She immediately began building a comprehensive case that went beyond simple identity theft. Her research revealed that my parents could be charged with racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that carried significant prison sentences and financial penalties. More importantly, she identified ways to pierce any asset protection they might have established, ensuring that I could recover every dollar they had stolen. The second ally emerged from the most unexpected source: my own extended family. My father's sister, Aunt Patricia, contacted me after seeing the newspaper article. She had been estranged from my father for 5 years over a business dispute, but my case had prompted her to examine her own financial records. She discovered that my parents had forged her signature on several documents related to their failed business ventures, making her another victim of their fraud scheme. Patricia brought more than moral support. She brought insider knowledge of my parents' financial dealings and business relationships. She had documentation of shady transactions, unexplained cash transfers, and a pattern of financial manipulation that stretched back over a decade. Her evidence showed that stealing from me was not an isolated incident, but part of a long-term pattern of fraud and deception. Through Patricia, I connected with other victims of my parents' schemes. There was the elderly neighbor whose identity they had used to open utility accounts they never paid. The family friend whose business they had defrauded through fake invoices and phantom services. Even my brother Mason, who had initially defended them, began to realize that they had stolen from him too, using his identity for smaller frauds while he was away at college. Each new victim brought additional evidence and legal claims against my parents. Rebecca worked to consolidate all the cases into a single massive civil lawsuit that would seek damages for everyone they had victimized. The criminal charges were expanding too, as Detective Martinez uncovered evidence of mail fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion related to their various schemes. The alliance also included surprising support from my professional network. My colleagues at the marketing firm where I worked had initially been sympathetic, but distant when I explained my situation. However, as the case gained media attention, several senior partners approached me with offers of support. The firm's legal department provided resources for dealing with the credit agencies, and the company's public relations team helped manage media requests so they did not interfere with my work. More importantly, my employer used my case as an example in their employee education programs about identity protection and financial security. This gave me a platform to speak publicly about family financial abuse and to help other victims recognize the warning signs. I discovered that I had a talent for public speaking and advocacy that I had never known existed. The community response was overwhelming. Local banks began inviting me to speak about identity protection. The district attorney's office asked me to testify before a legislative committee about the need for stronger laws protecting identity theft victims. Even the state attorney general's office reached out wanting to use my case as a model for prosecuting family financial fraud. But the most significant ally came through social media. A woman named Diana Thompson had seen my story online and recognized similarities to her own situation. She had been fighting her own parents over identity theft for 3 years, struggling with an overwhelmed legal system and skeptical law enforcement. We connected through email and began sharing strategies, evidence, and emotional support. Diana's case had stalled because she lacked the comprehensive documentation that had made my case so compelling. I helped her organize her evidence using the same systematic approach I had developed, and Rebecca agreed to review her case as well. Together, we began building a network of family fraud victims who could support each other through the legal process and recovery. The network grew rapidly as we connected with others through social media, legal aid organizations, and victim advocacy groups. We created a private online community where victims could share resources, vent frustrations, and celebrate victories. The group became a source of strength and validation for people who had been isolated and ashamed of their family's betrayal. Within 6 months of my case going public, our network included over 200 victims of family financial fraud from across the country. We had documentation of millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions, evidence of criminal behavior by family members who thought they could exploit blood relationships to avoid consequences. The scope of the problem was staggering, but so was the power of victims working together to demand justice. The alliance had transformed my individual case into a movement for change. We were no longer just seeking personal justice. We were fighting to reform laws that made it too easy for family members to exploit each other financially. We were demanding that financial institutions implement better verification procedures to prevent family fraud. We were insisting that law enforcement take these crimes seriously, even when they occurred within families. As I looked around the conference room during one of our monthly meetings, I realized how much had changed since that first devastating foreclosure notice. I was no longer the trusting daughter who had believed that family loyalty meant accepting abuse. I was a leader, an advocate, and a fighter who had found her voice and her power. The people who had tried to destroy me had instead created their worst nightmare, a victim who refused to stay silent, and who had the resources and determination to bring them to justice. Just when I thought our alliance was unbreakable, the foundation cracked in the most devastating way possible. Diana Thompson, The woman I had trusted with my deepest fears and strategic plans had been feeding information to my parents from the beginning. The discovery came through pure accident when Rebecca's investigator was tracking financial communications and found encrypted messages between Diana and my mother dating back to our first contact. The betrayal was sophisticated and calculated. Diana had never been a real victim. She was a family friend of my parents who had been planted in online support groups to identify potential threats to their legal defense. Her sob story about parental identity theft was entirely fabricated, designed to gain my trust and access to our legal strategy. For months, she had been reporting our every move, our evidence, our planned legal tactics, and even my emotional state to the people who had destroyed my life. Reading the intercepted messages felt like being betrayed all over again. Diana had sent detailed reports about my vulnerabilities, my fears about the legal process, and my concerns about the financial recovery. She had mocked my trust in our private messages to my mother, calling me naive and easily manipulated. Worst of all, she had been gathering personal information about other victims in our support network, creating dossiers that my parents planned to use for intimidation and legal manipulation. The discovery explained so much that had puzzled me over recent months. How my parents' attorney always seemed to anticipate our legal moves. Why certain evidence had mysteriously disappeared from court filings. How my parents had managed to hide assets so effectively despite our comprehensive investigation. Diana had been their inside source, feeding them our strategies while pretending to support our cause. But the betrayal went deeper than legal espionage. Diana had been manipulating our entire support network, identifying the most vulnerable members and feeding them discouraging information about their cases. She had convinced several victims to drop their legal claims, telling them that fighting family members was futile and would only result in more trauma. She had systematically undermined the solidarity we had built, weakening our collective power while strengthening my parents' position. The revelation shattered my confidence in my judgment and leadership. How could I have been so blind to someone who was actively sabotaging our efforts? How many other victims had been hurt because I had trusted the wrong person? The guilt was overwhelming, especially when I realized that Diana had used my platform and credibility to gain access to people who were already traumatized by family betrayal. Rebecca immediately filed emergency motions to seal our case files and protect the remaining network members from further infiltration. But the damage was extensive. Several victims withdrew from our group, too frightened and demoralized to continue fighting. Others questioned whether our entire movement had been compromised. The unity and momentum we had built over months was cracking under the weight of doubt and paranoia. My parents' legal team capitalized on the chaos immediately. They filed motions claiming that our support network was a criminal conspiracy designed to manufacture evidence and intimidate witnesses. They argued that the extensive documentation we had gathered was the result of coordinated harassment rather than legitimate investigation. Diana provided sworn testimony supporting these claims, painting me as the leader of a vindictive group that was persecuting innocent elderly parents. The media coverage shifted dramatically. Stories that had once portrayed me as a brave victim fighting for justice now questioned my motives and methods. Opinion pieces suggested that family disputes should be resolved privately, not through public campaigns and legal warfare. My reputation as a credible advocate began to erode as my parents' narrative of being victimized by an ungrateful daughter gained traction. The psychological impact was devastating. I found myself questioning every relationship, every alliance, every person who offered support. If I could be so wrong about Diana, who else might be deceiving me? The paranoia was consuming, making it difficult to function personally and professionally. I began withdrawing from the network I had built, afraid that my poor judgment was putting other victims at risk. The legal setbacks were immediate and severe. Evidence that we had gathered through our network was challenged as potentially compromised. Witness testimony was questioned because of possible coaching or coordination. Even my own credibility as a victim was undermined by suggestions that I had manufactured or exaggerated claims for public sympathy and financial gain. My parents, emboldened by their legal victories, began a counteroffensive designed to destroy what remained of my case. They filed a defamation lawsuit against me, claiming that my public statements about their alleged crimes had damaged their reputation and business relationships. They sought damages for lost income, emotional distress, and legal fees, essentially trying to make me pay for fighting back against their fraud. The defamation suit was particularly cruel because it forced me to defend every public statement I had made about their crimes. Even though the statements were true and supported by evidence, the legal cost of defending against their claims was enormous. They were using the legal system to further victimize me, knowing that I would have to spend thousands of dollars and countless hours defending myself against their baseless claims. As winter settled over the lake where my parents remained hidden, I sat in my apartment surrounded by legal documents and felt more alone than I had since the beginning of this nightmare. The alliance I had built was fragmenting, my reputation was under attack, and my financial situation was deteriorating under the weight of legal fees. Diana's betrayal had not only compromised our strategy, it had made me doubt my ability to judge people and situations accurately. But even in that darkest moment, I refused to surrender. My parents and their allies had underestimated the depth of my determination and the strength of my evidence. They thought that destroying my support network and attacking my credibility would force me to give up and accept their theft. They had forgotten that I was fighting not just for money, but for justice, dignity, and the right to hold family members accountable for their crimes. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also revealed important truths about my case and my character. I was stronger than I had realized, more resilient than my enemies had calculated. Diana's deception had hurt me, but it had not destroyed me. If anything, it had hardened my resolve and clarified my mission. I would not be deterred by setbacks, betrayals, or legal intimidation. I would find new allies, rebuild my case, and make my parents face the consequences of their crimes, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. The breakthrough that saved my case came from the most unexpected source: the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Marcus Rodriguez contacted me on a cold February morning, explaining that my parents' activities had triggered a multi-state investigation into identity theft rings operating within family networks. What I had thought was an isolated case of parental fraud was actually part of a larger criminal enterprise that spanned several states and involved dozens of victims. Agent Rodriguez explained that my comprehensive documentation and public advocacy had drawn federal attention to patterns of family financial fraud that were previously invisible to law enforcement. The FBI had been tracking unusual credit applications and mortgage fraud across multiple states, but they had lacked the insight needed to understand that many of these crimes were being committed by family members who exploited trust and access to personal information. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence that my parents were not just thieves, but organizers of a broader fraud network. They had been teaching other parents how to exploit their children's identities, sharing techniques for forging signatures and bypassing security measures. The lake house where they had been hiding was actually a meeting place for this criminal network where they planned coordinations and shared profits from their various schemes. Most importantly, the FBI had been monitoring Diana Thompson's communications for months before they contacted me. They knew she was a plant, and they had been using her to gather evidence against my parents' network while feeding her false information to protect the real investigation. My case had not been compromised. It had been the key that unlocked a federal investigation that would bring down an entire criminal organization. Agent Rodriguez showed me evidence that made my parents' individual crimes look small in comparison to their broader criminal enterprise. Bank records showed millions of dollars flowing through accounts controlled by their network. Identity theft reports from across the country revealed a pattern of family fraud that had victimized hundreds of people. Communications intercepts showed my parents bragging about their sophisticated techniques and their ability to exploit family loyalty to avoid prosecution. The federal investigation also revealed that Diana's betrayal had been anticipated and managed by the FBI. They had been feeding her false information about our legal strategy while gathering evidence about the criminal network's operations. Her reports to my parents had actually been helping the federal case by documenting their ongoing criminal activity and their attempts to obstruct justice in my case. With federal backing, our legal position transformed overnight. Rebecca worked with federal prosecutors to coordinate our civil lawsuit with the criminal investigation. Evidence that had been questioned because of Diana's involvement was now validated by independent federal investigation. Witnesses who had been intimidated into silence were now protected by federal witness protection programs. The new evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Federal agents had recorded conversations where my parents discussed their fraud techniques and laughed about exploiting their daughter's trust. They had documented financial transfers that showed exactly how stolen money flowed through the criminal network. They had even recovered deleted computer files that contained detailed plans for expanding their identity theft operations. But the most powerful new ally was someone I never expected: my brother Mason. The federal investigation had revealed that our parents had been stealing from him too, using his identity for business loans and credit cards while he was deployed overseas with the military. When Agent Rodriguez showed him the evidence, Mason's world collapsed, just as mine had months earlier. Mason's military training and security clearance made him a particularly valuable witness against our parents. His testimony would carry weight with prosecutors and juries who might otherwise be skeptical about family testimony. More importantly, his emotional journey from defender to victim to advocate mirrored the experience of many family fraud victims, making him a powerful voice for our cause. Together, Mason and I began rebuilding the victim support network with federal oversight and protection. We established new security protocols to prevent infiltration and created verification procedures to ensure that new members were genuine victims rather than plants. The FBI provided resources and training to help us identify suspicious behavior and protect sensitive information. The federal investigation also brought new victims forward, people who had been too frightened or ashamed to report their family members' crimes. Each new victim brought additional evidence against the criminal network and strengthened our collective case. The scope of the fraud was staggering: hundreds of victims across 15 states, millions of dollars in stolen funds, and a criminal organization that had operated for over a decade. Media coverage of the federal investigation vindicated my earlier advocacy and exposed Diana's deception. News outlets that had questioned my credibility now portrayed me as a whistleblower whose courage had exposed a major criminal enterprise. The narrative shifted from family dispute to federal crime story, with me cast as the hero who had brought criminals to justice rather than the ungrateful daughter attacking innocent parents. Financial institutions began reaching out proactively to resolve the fraudulent accounts and restore my credit. The mortgage company not only removed the fraudulent loan from my records, but also provided documentation that would help prosecute my parents. Credit card companies closed fraudulent accounts and provided detailed transaction records that traced the stolen money through the criminal network. Most satisfying was the discovery that my parents' attempts to hide their assets had failed spectacularly. Federal agents had tracked money through multiple account shell companies and even overseas transfers. Every dollar they had stolen was documented, tracked, and subject to seizure. Their lake house, their vehicles, their business interests, even their retirement accounts were now frozen pending criminal prosecution and civil judgment. As spring arrived and the federal investigation accelerated toward arrests and indictments, I reflected on how completely the situation had reversed. My parents had thought they were clever criminals who could exploit family relationships to commit fraud without consequences. Instead, they had created their own destruction by underestimating their victim and overestimating their own intelligence. The daughter they had betrayed and abandoned had become their worst nightmare. A federal witness with unshakable credibility, comprehensive evidence, and the determination to see justice served. Their attempt to destroy my life had instead exposed their criminal enterprise and brought down an entire network of family fraudsters. The karma they had earned through years of exploitation was finally coming to collect its debt. The arrests happened simultaneously across 3 states on a warm Tuesday morning in May. Federal agents surrounded the lake house where my parents had been hiding, while coordinated raids targeted other members of their criminal network. I watched the news coverage from Rebecca's office, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness as I saw my parents led away in handcuffs, their faces showing the shock of people who never believed they would face consequences for their actions. The federal indictments were comprehensive and devastating. My parents faced charges including conspiracy racketeering, identity theft, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. The evidence against them was overwhelming: recorded conversations, financial records, witness testimony, and their own documentation of criminal activity. Federal prosecutors were seeking maximum sentences that would put them in prison for 15 to 20 years. But the criminal charges were only the beginning of their consequences. Our civil lawsuit, now supported by federal evidence and witness protection, sought complete financial recovery plus punitive damages. Rebecca had identified every asset they owned or controlled, including properties they had hidden through shell companies and offshore accounts they thought were untraceable. The lake house, their primary residence, their vehicles, business interests, and retirement accounts were all subject to seizure and sale to pay their victims. The most satisfying moment came during my victim impact statement at their sentencing hearing. For the first time in over a year, I faced my parents directly across a courtroom. My father avoided eye contact, staring at his hands while I described how their betrayal had destroyed my trust, damaged my credit, and forced me to rebuild my entire life from scratch. My mother attempted to maintain her innocent victim facade, but her performance cracked when I detailed the evidence of her planning and coordination of their fraud schemes. I spoke not just for myself, but for all the victims they had betrayed over the years. The elderly neighbor whose utility bills they had never paid, the business partners they had defrauded through fake invoices, the children and grandchildren whose identities they had stolen for small frauds that seemed insignificant but destroyed young people's financial futures before they even began building credit. When I finished speaking, the silence in the courtroom was profound. Even my parents' attorney looked ashamed of the people he was representing. The judge's sentencing was swift and severe: 18 years for my father, 15 years for my mother, with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. They would be elderly when they were released, assuming they survived their prison terms. The financial judgment was equally comprehensive. The court ordered them to pay full restitution to all victims, plus punitive damages that tripled the amount owed. Their assets were seized and sold, with proceeds distributed to victims based on the amount they had been defrauded. I recovered not just the money they had stolen from me, but additional damages that compensated me for the emotional trauma, credit damage, and legal expenses they had caused. More importantly, the case established legal precedents that would protect future victims of family financial fraud. The court ruled that family relationships did not create any special immunity from fraud prosecution, and that family fraud should be treated as seriously as stranger fraud. Financial institutions were ordered to implement better verification procedures specifically designed to prevent family identity theft. The victim support network that had emerged from my case continued to grow and evolve. What had started as a small group of family fraud victims had become a national organization advocating for stronger laws, better law enforcement training, and improved financial institution procedures. We provided resources and support to new victims while working with legislators to reform laws that made family fraud too easy to commit and too difficult to prosecute. My brother Mason became a powerful advocate within the organization, using his military background and personal experience to reach victims who might not trust civilian advocates. His transformation from family loyalist to fraud victim to advocate demonstrated that anyone could overcome family betrayal and find strength in chosen family relationships built on truth rather than obligation. The professional opportunities that emerged from my advocacy work exceeded anything I could have imagined. Financial institutions hired me as a consultant on fraud prevention. Law enforcement agencies requested training on family fraud investigation techniques. Legislative committees sought my testimony on proposed laws protecting identity theft victims. I had found my calling in work that combined my personal experience with my professional skills to help others and prevent future crimes. But the most meaningful change was personal. The family I had lost through betrayal was replaced by a chosen family built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care. Rebecca became not just my attorney, but a dear friend who taught me that professional relationships could evolve into personal bonds based on shared mission and mutual admiration. Agent Rodriguez and his family included me in holiday celebrations and life events, creating the kind of supportive relationship that I had always thought only blood relatives could provide. The Victim Support Network became a source of lifelong friendships with people who understood trauma recovery and the strength required to rebuild life after betrayal. We celebrated each other's victories, supported each other through setbacks, and created the kind of community that nurtures growth rather than exploiting vulnerability. Most surprisingly, my relationship with Mason deepened and strengthened through our shared experience of victimization and recovery. We learned to communicate honestly about our feelings, our fears, and our hopes for the future. Our relationship was no longer based on childhood roles and family expectations, but on adult choice and mutual respect. We became the kind of siblings who chose each other rather than simply accepting family obligation. As I write this story 2 years after receiving that first foreclosure notice, I am amazed by the journey that began with such devastation and led to such unexpected growth. My parents' attempt to destroy my financial future had instead launched me into advocacy work that gives my life meaning and purpose. Their betrayal had taught me to value chosen relationships over blood obligations and to trust people based on their actions rather than their family status. The lake house where they had hidden while planning their legal defense is now owned by a young family who turned it into a loving home filled with laughter and honest relationships. The money they stole has been recovered and invested in education and advocacy that will prevent future victims from experiencing the trauma they inflicted. Their criminal network has been dismantled, their techniques exposed, and their victims empowered to rebuild their lives with support and resources. Sometimes I wonder if they understand in their federal prison cells that their greatest crime was not stealing money, but teaching their daughter that family loyalty should never require accepting abuse. They created a victim who refused to stay silent, who fought back with intelligence and determination, who turned their betrayal into a movement for justice that continues to protect others from similar exploitation. The karma they earned through years of exploitation has been fully collected, but the growth and strength I gained through fighting back continues to compound. They thought they were taking my future. Instead, they gave me a mission, a purpose, and a chosen family that enriches my life in ways that blood relationships never could. If you have experienced family financial betrayal, I want you to know that you are not alone and you are not powerless. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted had been stealing from you? How did you handle the betrayal when family loyalty conflicted with seeking justice? Share your story in the comments because your experience might help someone else find the courage to fight back. Smash that like button if this story resonated with your own experience of family drama and the sweet satisfaction of karma finally arriving. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because justice served is always worth celebrating, and I will keep sharing stories about people who refuse to let family manipulation destroy their lives. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that chosen family built on respect is always stronger than blood family built on exploitation. Thank you for being part of this community that values truth over comfortable lies, and remember that sometimes the family that tries to break you is just clearing the way for the family that will help you soar.